Hi, I'm Jaden Matthias, and today we'll be going through the main principles of lab safety to help keep you and others safe in your lab work. Nationwide rules and regulations have been put in place to ensure the safety of all lab work in the UK. These include the Health and Safety at Work Act, the 2002 COSH regulations, the UCAS regulations, and many quality standards that all labs must follow. Lab safety can be separated into 5 main areas: emergency, health and safety procedures, risk assessment, chemical waste disposal, and specialist equipment. Let's start with emergency. At the sound of an alarm, you should proceed to leave the building via the evacuation protocol at your school or college. You should follow the emergency evacuation routes to the delegated assembly points and do not re-enter the building until the alarms have stopped and you are told it is safe to do so. In the case of an area being contaminated by a toxic material, you must evacuate the area immediately. Seal the area by closing the doors as you exit and tell people to stay clear of the area. Activate the nearest fire alarms and inform teachers or lab technicians. In the case of a small fire, it is important to use the appropriate extinguisher or fire blanket to deal with it. However, if the fire is not manageable, you should evacuate the area and activate the nearest fire alarm if it is not already automatically activated. All fume hoods should be closed. When it comes to injuries, alert the first aider, and in the case of a serious injury, call emergency services. If you come across an injured person, stay with them until help comes. Wounds should be cleaned and covered as quickly as possible to stop and slow bleeding and prevent contamination. Burns should be held under cold water for at least 10 to 15 minutes depending on the severity. In the case of a power shortage, fume hoods will be deactivated. To prevent the escape of dangerous fumes, they should be closed and the lab technicians should be informed. If the power is out for a significant amount of time and you are advised to leave, you should close all doors as you exit. Do not re-enter until it is safe to do so. In the unlikely event of a flood, if you can, stop the source of the flooding. Notify your teachers or lab technicians and do not touch electrical equipment until it is no longer connected to the mains. Next, let's talk about health and safety. Health and safety can be split into 3 main components: first aid, personal safety, and COVID safety. First aid is the initial help received by an injured person before full medical attention can be given. In all situations listed, the delegated first aider should be informed immediately. If someone is cut, you should look to clean the wound and apply pressure with a tissue to slow any bleeding. If possible, try to avoid touching the blood and do not attempt to remove any shards of broken glass. If you or somebody else has received a burn, it should be held under cold water for at least 10 to 15 minutes. Only apply burn cream if the burn is first degree and not very severe. If available, safety showers and eye wash stations should be used in the case of chemical contact with skin or eyes. Chemicals must be washed off as quickly as possible, and if these are not available, you can use a tap. If chemicals have been inhaled, move to a well-ventilated area immediately, and if chemicals have been swallowed, you must try to identify the chemical to inform the first aider. If someone has been electrocuted, be sure not to touch or move them if they are still in contact with the source of the shock. Try to turn off or move the source if possible, and call the relevant emergency number if necessary. If someone has fallen or received an impact injury, you should notify the first aider. If someone is unconscious, you should call the relevant emergency number and notify the first aider. Now, this section will look at how to keep you and others safe. General safety rules say that you should prepare for each lab session beforehand. Never work in an empty lab, never bring food or drink into the lab, and to make sure your workspace is kept clean as you go along. Let's look into some other areas of personal safety in more detail. Safety glasses or goggles must be worn to protect your eyes, and it may be advised that you do not wear contact lenses in the lab. To protect your skin and clothes, a lab cloak that covers your arms must be worn at all times. Gloves may be necessary when handling certain chemicals, appropriate shoes should be worn, and long hair should be tied up. Some experiments may require the use of a fume hood to prevent dangerous fumes or powders from contaminating the lab. Do not put your head in the fume hood and completely close the sash or panel when you have finished using it. Stools should also be kept away from the fume hoods to keep them clear. It is important to be aware of the hazards of each chemical before you start the lab. This will be covered in your risk assessments, which should be completed before every experiment. You should be aware of the chemical hazard symbols used to describe chemicals, and if a spill occurs, you should use absorbent granules to mop it up if available. Specific chemical hazards include cryogens like liquid nitrogen and dry ice, which can cause freeze burns, radioactive material, carcinogens, common solvents as they can be toxic and flammable, and biohazards. All glassware should be appropriately cleaned up once you have finished using it. If glass breaks, you should sweep it up with a dustpan and brush and empty into the designated glass bin. Glassware being used under vacuum must be covered in tape or netting to protect you in the case of implosion. The tap or station to wash glassware may be separate to the one used to wash your hands. When using electronics, make sure to check for any significant problems with the wire or plug. If the equipment gets wet, do not touch it until it has been disconnected from the mains. You must also be aware of specific equipment in labs. If you are using a rotary evaporator, all hair, clothes or wires should be kept clear of rotating parts. If refrigerators or freezers are present in the lab, all items should be properly covered and sealed so they do not leak, and you should never store food in chemical refrigerators or freezers. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, new regulations have been put in place to upkeep social distancing rules in labs in the UK. For example, you must maintain 2 meters between you and the people around you. Face masks must be worn at all times, and you should use hand sanitizer as you enter or exit the lab. Let's briefly cover risk assessments. Risk assessments are required before all lab work. A risk assessment should identify the risks that could affect your health and safety and should contain ways to minimize any risks that are present. This in turn should give you the information needed to keep yourself and others safe. It should contain physical hazards as well as chemical or biological hazards. Lab design is also very important. Designing the lab appropriately can help to make it safer. For example, minimizing the transportation of certain chemicals or preparing the correct waste bins for the lab. It is very important to clean up the chemicals you have used and produced safely after an experiment. This is to prevent the production of new hazards, contamination, and to keep you or other people safe when the lab is used next. All chemicals that need to be disposed of should be identified by name. Products that are not toxic and non-polluting are safe to be put down the drain with a large amount of water. Other products may need to be mixed with other chemicals first in order to flush them down the drain. It may be necessary to store the waste in a designated container until it can be properly disposed of by lab technicians. You may have separate containers for certain products as mixing them could cause a hazard. Specific chemicals should be disposed of with caution and information on their disposal should be accessible. Clinical and radioactive waste should be put in a specially labeled bag and collected for incineration. Sharp objects that may be contaminated, such as needles, are collected in a special bin for incineration. Pharmaceutical waste can be treated as chemical waste. This may be slightly different for dangerous drugs. Finally, a quick look at hazards associated with specialist equipment. NMR machines produce extremely strong magnetic and electromagnetic fields. These fields can interfere with pacemakers, and it may not be safe for users to enter an NMR housing facility. X-ray diffraction machines produce ionizing electromagnetic radiation, which can be extremely dangerous. People using these machines should minimize the time spent around them, be as far as possible from the machine while in use, and make sure you're shielded from the X-rays with a material that blocks the radiation, such as lead. Lasers can cause damage to eyes and skin, and are also a potential fire hazard. Goggles should be worn at all times, all reflective things should be removed, for example jewelry, and skin should be fully covered to prevent burns. I hope this presentation has been useful. Stay safe and enjoy your lab work. Thank you for listening.